My parents blamed me for everything. They kicked me out of the house at 9 years old. 15 years later. They want me to return only to save their reputation. When I was 9 years old, my life took a turn that I couldn't understand at the time. Now I'm 24 years old and looking back, everything makes sense. Although it's still just as painful. My parents always seemed to resent me. But I never understood why. From a very young age, I felt that I was more of a burden than a joy in their lives. They were young when they had me, barely out of their own homes and facing adulthood. I understand that. But it doesn't justify what happened later. I remember specific moments that defined my childhood. There were no hugs. No words of encouragement. Only strict rules and impossible expectations to meet. Every mistake I made, no matter how small, turned into an endless sermon about how I was ruining their lives. My grades were never good enough. My behaviors were a constant source of scolding. But in front of others, we were always the perfect family. Everything exploded the day my mother announced she was pregnant again. I was almost 9 years old and didn't completely understand what it meant. I just remember the euphoria on her face and the way her friends and family congratulated them. For a moment, I thought things would change. That a new baby would bring some joy to our house. But the only thing it brought was my exile. A few weeks after that news, my mother began packing my things in boxes. It was as if I had ceased to exist for them. They told me it would be better for everyone if I went to live with my uncle in another city. My world crumbled. The house where I grew up, my friends, my school, everything was going to disappear. I tried to beg. I promised to improve my grades, behave better, be the son they wanted. But it was clear that their minds were already made up. I clearly remember the last day. My father took me to the bus station. And for the first time in a long time, he tried to explain to me why this was for the best. It's not because we don't love you, he said, his words sounding empty. It's because we believe you will be better with someone who can give you more attention. But even at my young age, I knew that wasn't it. It wasn't about me being better. It was about them getting rid of a problem. I arrived at my uncle's house crying, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they would call me and say it was all a mistake. But that call never came. The first few weeks were the most difficult. My uncle tried to comfort me, but he couldn't fill the void that my parents left. At night, I would cry until I fell asleep, wondering what I had done to deserve that. Little by little, my life with my uncle began to take shape. He was the complete opposite of my parents. Patient, kind, and always willing to listen. It took me time to trust him. But eventually, I realized that his home was much warmer and safer than my old house had ever been. My school performance improved. I made new friends. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something similar to happiness. But even while my life was improving, resentment towards my parents grew. They rarely called. And when they did, it was more out of courtesy than genuine concern. The only time they visited was to make sure I was behaving better. They didn't care about my emotional well-being. They only wanted to validate their decision to have sent me away. The years passed. And although my uncle became my father figure, I always wondered why my parents abandoned me that way. Was I so hard to believe? Why did they never make an effort to reach out? What I didn't know then was that 15 years later, those same people who rejected me would reappear. Not out of love or remorse, but because they needed to use me to save their own reputation. The years passed. And although I learned to live without my parents, the memory of their rejection remained an open wound. I graduated from high school with honors. Something I never imagined in my darkest days. My uncle, who by then was more like a father to me, cried at my graduation ceremony. Something my parents would never have done. For them. I no longer X-. But then at 24 years old, just when I thought I had finally left all that behind, I received a call that I never expected. It was my mother. The sound of her voice was like a punch in the chest. So much time had passed that I barely recognized her. And although I wanted to hang up immediately, curiosity stopped me. "We want to talk to you," she said, trying to sound sweet. But her tone was so forced that I could almost feel the interest behind each word. "Your dad and I have been thinking about you a lot." Thinking about me? After 15 years of ignoring me? I felt a mixture of disbelief and anger. But I said nothing. Instead, I let her keep talking. She told me that things at home weren't going so well. My sister, who was now 15 years old, was acting out. She didn't go into details at first, but I could hear the stress in her voice. Then she blurted out the real reason for her call. "We thought it would be good for you to come back and stay with us for a while. You know, so the family can be together again." I had to bite my tongue not to laugh. United? Since when were we a united family? But I decided not to lose my cool. Instead, I asked her why. After so many years, they now wanted me to return. There was an awkward pause. And then she blurted it out. "It's just that we need to show people that we are a good family." That phrase hit like a lightning bolt. It wasn't about me. It never had been. They wanted me to come back not because they missed me or wanted to fix things, but because their reputation was at stake. Apparently, my sister had been causing a lot of problems, and people in their social circle were judging them as parents. They wanted to use me as living proof that they could raise good children. "So, they want me to be their trophy?" I asked, my voice full of sarcasm. "It's not that," my mother quickly replied. But we both knew that it was. She tried to justify it by saying that they wanted to fix our relationship. But by then it was already evident that everything was a farce. I hung up before she could say anything else and turned off the phone. My head was full of thoughts. I felt rage, sadness, and some relief at finally having the confirmation of what I had always suspected. My parents never really cared about me. A few days later, they called my uncle, probably thinking they could convince him to persuade me, to manipulate me. He told me everything. And as always, he supported me. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," he told me. I didn't answer their calls or messages for weeks. But they didn't give up. They kept insisting, sending messages that went from begging to blaming me for abandoning them. According to them, I had a duty to help them because they were my parents. That was the trigger. My uncle encouraged me to face the situation directly. Not because he believed I should listen to them, but because he knew that sooner or later I needed to set a definitive limit. So, I finally answered them. I asked them to meet me in person. Not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed to look them in the eye and tell them everything I had been holding in for years. When we met, I was surprised at how different they looked. My parents, always so concerned about appearances, now looked worn out. It was obvious that the situation with my sister had affected them more than they wanted to admit. They began by talking about how proud they were of how far I had come in life. It was almost comical to hear that coming out of their mouths, considering that they had absolutely nothing to do with my success. Then they moved on to the important thing. They wanted me to come home to give them a second chance as a family. "You don't need a second chance," I calmly told them. "You need to accept that you are not good parents." My words left them in shock. For years I had fantasized about that moment. But now that it was happening, I didn't feel satisfaction, only emptiness. I explained to them how they made me feel during my childhood, how they abandoned me, and how they never cared about me until it was convenient for them. They tried to interrupt several times, but I didn't allow it. Finally, I told them the truth that they needed to hear. I don't need a family that uses me as a trophy. The only family I have is my uncle, because he was there when you weren't. I got up and left, leaving behind two people who had lost their right to call themselves my parents a long time ago. But the story doesn't end there. The encounter was just the beginning of a series of events that would reveal even more hidden truths and change my life. And my sister's. Forever. After that meeting, I thought I was finally done with them. But I couldn't have been more wrong. What followed was a desperate attempt by my parents to clear their name at any cost. The first thing they did was try to manipulate other family members to intercede for them. My uncles, my grandparents, and even some cousins began to call me, asking me why I couldn't just give them a chance. However, to my surprise, not everyone in the family was on my parents' side. My uncle, who raised me, spoke to several family members to tell them the truth about what really happened years ago. Until then, many had assumed that my parents sent me to live with him because it was best for me. No one knew the reality that they simply wanted to get rid of me because I didn't fit into their vision of a perfect family. Meanwhile, my sister continued to be the center of the storm. Apparently, her behavior had worsened the situation that started it all. And what my parents didn't mention in our meeting was that she was caught smoking at a party. It wouldn't be such a shocking thing in a teenager. Except that she was barely 15 years old. What really terrified them was not the act itself, but that it happened in front of several friends and acquaintances of the family, who did not hesitate to criticize my parents as if it were their favorite sport. How did you let this happen? Where were you? It's obvious that you don't know how to raise your children. Those were the words that I was told later. My parents heard repeatedly that night. And instead of facing the reality of their failure as parents, they decided that the solution was to bring me back to show me as the successful son. But they didn't count on the fact that I was no longer the defenseless child they could silence. My maternal grandparents, after learning what really happened, began to investigate more about how they had raised my sister. They realized that my parents had not only spoiled her but had practically left her to her own devices. According to my grandparents, my parents gave her ridiculous amounts of money to keep her happy and let her do whatever she wanted to avoid confrontations. They created a monster, my grandmother told me on the phone, with a mixture of sadness and anger. And now they expect you to fix everything. It was then that my grandparents began to consider a radical measure, seeking custody of my sister. Although they didn't want to separate her completely from my parents, they believed that she needed a more structured environment to correct her path before it was too late. When my parents found out about this, it was as if the world had collapsed on them. They began to call me frantically, accusing me of giving ideas to my grandparents and ruining their lives. But the truth was that I had done nothing. My parents had ruined it all on their own. Soon after, my sister called me for the first time in years. She was nervous but curious. "Why do they say you are angry with them?" she asked. I didn't know exactly what to tell her. How to explain to a teenager that her parents were using her as a tool to clear their reputation. So I was honest, but careful. I told her how they had treated me when I was younger and how they sent me to live with our uncle. I also told her that I didn't blame her for anything, because all this was our parents' fault and not hers. There was a long silence before she replied. "They don't talk much about you either," she admitted. "They always said you were the problematic one. But now I'm not so sure." That conversation left me with mixed feelings. On one hand, I felt sorry for my sister. She had been raised in a toxic environment, full of privileges but empty of true love or limits. On the other hand, I was glad that she was finally beginning to question the narratives that our parents had instilled in her. Meanwhile, my grandparents didn't stop. They sought legal advice. And after weeks of discussions, they managed to obtain temporary custody of my sister. My parents were furious, but they couldn't do much to avoid it, considering the mountain of evidence of neglect and poor parenting that accumulated against them. During this time, my relationship with my sister began to flourish. We talked on the phone almost every day. She told me about her life, her frustrations, and her fears. For the first time, I realized that I had not only lost my parents but had also lost the opportunity to know my sister while growing up. "Do you think we could be a family someday?" she asked me one night, with a vulnerability that broke my heart. "It depends on how we define family," I replied. "But if family means supporting and caring for each other, then yes. I think we already are." My words seemed to relieve her a little, but I knew that the road ahead would be complicated. Meanwhile, my parents continued trying to save their image. But every attempt only sunk them further into the contempt of family and friends. Over time, things began to calm down. My sister was slowly adapting to living with my grandparents. And although she was still somewhat rebellious, she was beginning to show signs of change. For my part, I felt that I could finally breathe easily after years of tension. However, everything changed when my aunt, my father's sister, decided to talk to me. Until then, she had maintained a prudent distance in all this family conflict. She was always kind to me, but she had never gotten too involved. At least not openly. However, one afternoon, she called me and asked me to meet. Her voice had a strange tone, as if she was about to tell me something she had been holding in for a long time. We met at a coffee shop. And from the moment we sat down, I knew that something important was going to come out of that conversation. After a few minutes of small talk, she finally took a deep breath and got to the point. "There are things that I think you need to know," she said with an apologetic tone. "Things that happened before they sent you to your uncle." What she told me was shocking. According to my aunt, my parents had been struggling financially since before I was born. They married young, and my arrival was a surprise that complicated their situation even more. But what really complicated things was the dysfunctional relationship they had. "Your mother always felt that she sacrificed too much by having you," my aunt said, lowering her gaze. "And your father never knew how to handle that pressure. So, instead of facing it together, they started blaming each other." What was even more disturbing was that apparently they had discussed the idea of putting me up for adoption when I was a baby. It was my maternal grandmother who intervened and convinced them to keep me. But that decision was not the end of their problems. And over time, their mutual resentment was channeled towards me. They saw in you everything they couldn't handle. My aunt continued. "And when your mother became pregnant with your sister, they saw it as an opportunity to start over." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents had not only sent me away for convenience. They had done it as part of a deliberate plan to erase their past and focus on their new life. "But here is what you really need to know," my aunt said, leaning forward. "When they sent you to live with your uncle, they had no intention of looking for you again. It was your uncle who insisted that they keep sending you money. If it hadn't been for him, they probably wouldn't have even done that." I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and surprisingly relief. I had always known that my parents didn't really love me. But hearing the details of how it all happened gave me a kind of closure. I finally understood why I had always felt like I didn't fit into their lives. After our conversation, my aunt apologized for not speaking sooner. "I wanted to protect you. But now I see that you deserve to know the truth." With this new information, I felt more determined than ever to protect my sister. Although I couldn't change my past, maybe I could help her avoid making the same mistakes I did. Meanwhile, my parents continued trying to repair their reputation. My grandparents, seeing their lack of remorse and the obvious negligence they showed towards my sister, decided to expedite the process to obtain full custody. It was then that more truths began to emerge. Not only about their treatment of me but also about how they had handled my sister's upbringing. My grandparents discovered that they had left my sister unsupervised on multiple occasions, allowing her to go to parties without limits and giving her absurd amounts of money to keep her happy. This had not only affected her behavior, but it had also led to more serious problems that my parents were trying to hide. When these revelations came to light, my parents began to lose the little support they had left in the family. Those who had previously defended them now turned away, and the criticism became increasingly stronger. In the midst of all this, my sister and I continued to strengthen our relationship. She began to trust me in a way I never imagined. She told me her fears, her frustrations, and how she felt lost in the chaos that our parents had created. "I always thought you were the problem," she confessed to me one night during one of our long calls. "That's what they said. But now I see that you were just a victim like me." Those words hit me deeply. For years, I had carried the guilt of not being good enough for my parents. Hearing my sister acknowledge the truth made me feel that maybe we were finally breaking the cycle. After weeks of late-night calls with my sister and shocking revelations from my aunt and other family members, it seemed that the family conflict was reaching its climax. My grandparents officially filed for full custody of my sister, and the hearings began to reveal more than any of us expected. In one of the first hearings, my grandparents presented evidence of my parents' negligence. From financial records showing the irresponsible use of their income to testimonies from neighbors who had seen my sister wandering alone late at night. Everything seemed to confirm what the family already suspected. My parents had never been fit to raise any of their children. But the real blow came when my aunt was called to testify. Her account was devastating. She described how my parents had debated getting rid of me since I was born, how they had ignored their responsibilities as parents, and how even now with my sister, they were still repeating the same patterns. My parents' defense was weak. They tried to blame me for influencing my sister from afar, even though we had barely spoken until a few months ago. They also tried to pass off their decisions as well-intentioned mistakes. But it was clear that no one in the room believed them. While this was happening, my relationship with my sister continued to grow. Each call, each message strengthened our bond. She began to trust more in my grandparents, who with patience and love were working to give her the stability she never had. But there were also moments of struggle. My sister was full of anger and resentment, not only towards our parents but also towards herself. "Do you think I'm already ruined?" she asked me one night, her voice barely a whisper. I answered without hesitation. What we have been through does not define us. What we do next does. That conversation marked a turning point. My sister began to attend therapy, something my grandparents insisted was necessary. At first, she hated it. But over time she began to open up and face the demons she had accumulated for years. For my part, although I was glad to see her progress, I still had unfinished business with my parents. After the initial hearings, they tried to reach out again. This time with a mixture of pleas and emotional manipulation. "You're our son at the end of the day," my mother would say in a call. "We just want to fix things." But I knew that wasn't true. Every word was imbued with selfishness. They didn't want to fix things out of love. They wanted to do it because they needed to restore their image. Finally, I decided to meet with them one last time. Not to reconcile, but to close this chapter once and for all. We met in a public park, a neutral place. When I saw them, I realized how much they had changed. They looked defeated, but there was still a spark of pride in their eyes, as if they believed they could still control the narrative. "I'm not here to argue," I told them as we sat down. "I just want to make something clear. I don't need anything from you. And I don't expect you to need anything from me." My father opened his mouth to respond, but I stopped him. "Let me finish," I explained. "My life has improved because of the distance I kept from you. And there is no chance of me returning to your orbit." I told them that if they really wanted to show that they had changed, it was not me they had to convince, but my sister. There was a long silence after that. My mother seemed about to cry, while my father simply stared at the ground. Finally, I got up and left, knowing that I had said everything I needed to say. The following weeks were a whirlwind of changes. My grandparents won full custody of my sister, and she began to flourish under their care. She joined a sports team at her school, something she had never considered before, and began to surround herself with friends who really supported her. For my part, I felt that a weight was lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the burden of proving myself to myself or anyone else. I had made peace with my past, and although the pain was still there, it no longer defined me. The last thing I heard from my parents was that they tried to move to another city to start over, away from the critical eyes of family and friends. I don't know if they managed to find the peace they were looking for, but I know that it's not something that concerns me anymore. As for my sister and I, we continue to build our relationship. We talk almost every day. And recently she came to visit me in the city where I live. We spent hours recalling moments from our childhood and dreaming about the future, one that finally feels full of possibilities.